Maybe you're the type of person who yells, "It's a myth," when you hear someone say, "Searing the meat seals in the juices." But do you actually know why that's a myth? And do you know why we started saying that in the first place? No one in particular. Bear with me, it's story time. Kenelm Digby was an English courtier, philosopher, diplomat and scientist during the reign of Charles I. He liked to cook, and it is believed that his wife Venetia tasted many of his dishes. He's known for the publication of The Closet of the Eminently Learned Sir Kenelm Digby Knight Opened. However, Digby didn't write the book himself. It is believed that it was Hartman, his steward, who took Digby's notes and recipes and wrote this book, publishing it after Digby's death with his son's consent. In this book we have a version of the seal in the juices technique. Baste them once all over very well with fresh butter. Then presently powder it all over very thin with flour. This, by continuing turning before the fire, will make a thin crust, which will keep in all the juice of the meat. It is not only suggested to sear the meat, but also cover it with flour. Thanks for the yummy tip, Digby. But how did this small fragment of a cookery book spread so much even to this day? Justus von Liebig was a German scientist from the 19th century. He's known for his studies in organic chemistry. And yes, you guessed it, food is organic. Liebig became interested in meat when looking for an expensive way to provide nutritious food for people. He would boil meat and reduce the liquid into cubes. That was the start of what we nowadays know as stock cubes. If you're wondering how boiling meat was an inexpensive way to make food, it wasn't, and he had to find other sources for the raw materials. But that's a story for another day. But creating stock cubes was not the only thing he did related to cooking. In 1947, he published Researches on the Chemistry of Food. In his publication, Liebig shows his interest in nutrition. With his research, he came to understand that there are substances in the juices of the meat that are nutritious. Therefore, he concluded that it is important to eat the soup of the boiled meat, not only the meat itself. He even argues that meat from which soup has been made is neither nutritious nor digestible without the soup. Today we know it's not that simple, but yes, many nutritious substances are lost in the water that is used to boil meat. He studied how meat's proteins and blood, which we now know it's not blood but myoglobin, reacted to different factors. He understood that meat tenderness depends on the quantity of protein the fibers had. But he also knew that the meat could be either hard or juicy depending on how long and at which temperature it is cooked. He wrote, "When it is introduced into the boiling water, the albumen immediately coagulates from the surface inwards, and in this state forms a crust or shell which no longer permits the external water to penetrate into the interior of the mass of flesh." However, he was interested in preparing nutritious soups, which he would later use for his famous stock cubes. So he did the opposite thing, that is, he put the meat into cold water and very gradually brought it to a boil. By cooking it this way, all the good stuff of the interior of the flesh would escape and dissolve into the water, leaving a tough and hard meat, but a nutritious soup. So he believed that quick and hot cooking meant the nutritious substances inside the flesh wouldn't leave the meat, whereas slow and gradual heat did. But this was all regarding the boiling of the meat. He never talked about roasting the meat to retain moisture. A few years after Liebig's publication, Sarah Josepha Hale published The Lady's New Book of Cookery. Hale was an editor at a women's magazine. Fun fact, she helped create the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. And you'll probably know the lyrics of her best hit by heart, "Mary Had a Little Lamb." Maybe that lamb was seared to seal in the juices, which would make a very tragic nursery rhyme. I digress. So, in this book, she often quotes Liebig's work. However, she summarizes Liebig's theory on meat cooking methods without directly quoting him on that. She even goes a step further and explains that the same boiling method used to prevent the meat juices from escaping can be applied to roasting. It's funny because, as Harold Magee points out in his New York Times article, her recipes don't include these searing methods, and contrary to that, she suggests that roasts should be put at a moderate distance from the fire and gradually brought nearer. Else, the meat will be overdone halfway through the joint and be nearly raw at the bone. However, I believe that it was Auguste Escoffier who made this myth stick. His work as a French chef and writer is essential to the history of gastronomy. He is considered the founder of modern cuisine, so it makes sense that whatever technique he was using was the trend in the kitchens. In his book Le Guide Culinaire, his indications for braising meat were heat some clarified fat of white consommé in a thick saucepan of convenient size, or a braising pan, and when it is sufficiently hot, put the meat in the saucepan and let it acquire color on all sides. The object of this operation is to cause a contraction of the pores of the meat, thereby surrounding the latter with a species of cuirass which prevents the inner juices from escaping too soon and converting the braising into a boiling process. He doesn't further explain this. Did he take this idea from Hale? From Liebig? Did he just test it by himself in his kitchen and quite oddly come to the same mistaken conclusion as Liebig? We'll never know, or at least I don't have the answer to this. If it's a myth, why did so many people write that searing the meat would seal in the juices? And why do we keep saying it? As it happens with everything, the best lies are the ones that have a bit of truth in them. First of all, let's understand why this is false. Of course, we as consumers want good quality meat, and I'm sure that juiciness is one of the quality indicators you look for when chewing a steak. For this reason, the meat industry has paid a lot of attention to this in the last few years. Juiciness is actually a perception we have when eating, and not a factor given solely by the ingredient itself. This perception of juiciness can be split into two different organoleptic components: the moisture impression we get during the first masticatory movements, and the sustained persistence of juiciness. The first one is related to the so-called water-holding capacity, and the latter is affected by the stimulating effect of fat on our salivary flow when masticating. So as you can see, everyone we mentioned before was only considering the water-holding capacity. To be more precise, they were only considering the effect of temperature on the water-holding capacity. Today we know that there are many factors that affect the water-holding capacity of meat. For instance, the way in which animals are slaughtered is directly related to the water-holding capacity of their meat, as when they suffer from stress, the resulting meat can be very deficient in this regard. But other factors such as pH, salinity, types of muscle fiber are also relevant when considering water-holding capacity. Okay, and why would heat not help with it? Let's get sciencey. As you may already know, meat is made from proteins. Proteins are kind of a long chain, and when the meat is raw, these chains are all tangled up, so to speak. In this state, water is trapped in all those loops and tangles. But when we start to apply heat, the chains start to untangle, and water has no other place to go but outside the meat. This process is called protein denaturation. I'm sorry, Escoffier, but searing the meat doesn't contract the meat pores because there are no pores. There are just proteins waiting to release the water they have trapped. This is the reason why meat shrinks when cooking it. Now we know why searing the meat to seal in the juices is incorrect. But what is the true part? I believe it's a misconception of what juiciness is and what makes meat taste delicious. Sure, we already discussed that juiciness is an important quality factor to consider, but if it was the only one, raw meat would be more delicious than seared meat, which I think we can all agree is not the case. It's as simple as the Maillard reaction. You might have heard of this one. Maillard reaction is responsible for the brown crust we all love in meat. Proteins plus sugars plus high heat equals Maillard reaction, equals a new world of flavor molecules that make meat taste meaty. Regardless of the temperature we use to cook the meat, we will eventually lose water because of the protein denaturation. The thing is that the Maillard reaction only happens at high temperatures. So yes, searing the meat takes the flavor to another level, but it doesn't seal in the juices. However, this doesn't answer what Liebig proposed. He always talked about boiled meat and never seared meat. We know we can achieve the Maillard reaction when searing, but you've never seen browning in boiled meat, right? The temperature at which the Maillard reaction starts to happen is at 140 Celsius degrees, but water starts to evaporate at 100 Celsius degrees. I think his experiments would be explained by the action of collagen, but that's research for another day. What can we do to seal in the juices? Well, I guess we have to accept the fact that there's going to be water loss when cooking meat, no matter what. The industry has different techniques to increase the water holding capacity, but for now we'll get less technical and we'll think more as home cooks. The two main things I do to make meat more juicy are: first, choose the right type of meat for the right type of recipe. Each cut has different compositions of muscle fiber, water and fat, so not all cuts are good for every dish. If you're going to do any type of stew, cuts with a higher content of collagen are the way to go. Cook them slowly and at low temperatures, and sear them beforehand to create that yummy crust. If, however, you want to fry or grill meat, go for cuts that don't have that high amount of collagen. Remember that the fat will help with the sustained perception of juiciness, so if you choose leaner cuts, a nice sauce can help mask their dryness. Another option is to brine the meat. In many cases, this helps with tenderness and water holding capacity, as well as with flavor, if you decide to add herbs and spices. When researching this topic, I came across a wonderful article written by Harold Magee for the New York Times. This video was done thanks to his work, plus a bit more research just for fun. I will leave all the bibliography in the description box. And if anyone's watching, feel free to join the conversation.